So hello, welcome everyone. My name is Amanda Dominguez. Welcome. I am a public participation specialist for the Department of Toxic Substance Control. Welcome to the. I am a public participation specialist. Thank you. Please let me know if that happens again. I am a public participation specialist for the Department of Toxic Substance Control. I am going to be a support for this dialogue, assisting with a number of things. So first off, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday to engage in such a necessary conversation. We are here in LA Trenton, which is the first location for first of our three meetings. Here, LA Trenton Charter, they've been extremely accommodating. Thank you so much. Luis Ramirez, who is not in the room, has offered the space, so we thank them for that. Thank you for joining. And so now I'd like to go ahead and just acknowledge Mosin Nazim, our director, who will be joining, chief director, who will be joining us here just to go ahead and have a listen for the first part of the afternoon here. And then I also would like to acknowledge our co-hosts, the Normal Action Committee and the People's Senate. We have Cynthia Babbitt here with us today. She would like to share a couple of words with us as to your participation.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I had a handout on the stairs down there, and which is really the problem statement, and from our point of view and why we're here today. And you know, it's a very serious issue of contaminated soils and the way they affect our families and in my community, because we have reached out and we're aware of other EJ communities in the state and out of the state. It got to a point where some of our sites were being cleaned up, and then it was where soils are going to. And on one of our sites, they stockpiled the soils, and on the first page of this handout is the list of facilities that they gave me where the soil might go to. And I had to do my own research and found that a lot of the facilities weren't even permitted. There was a lot of controversy around them, and so rather than us send our contamination to somebody else's community, we needed to have other solutions. So we hope that this dialogue will give us a background on what has been happening in the state, but also reach into how contaminated soils can be safely destroyed by technology, so we don't have instances where we've seen across with the hurricane how you can have a Superfund site here and then there it's gone. You know, so if there are technologies that are available to safely destroy the contamination, then that would be a preferred remedy. And also, very importantly, is how do communities have more of a say in the decision-making process? And so, selfishly, I'm here for the dialogue because I need these answers, because I still have these stockpiles of soil in my community, and as they clean up more, it's going to become really important to us to be good stewards and not just, you know, pass it on to the next person to deal with. That's not always going to be the case, but we hope that's the depth of the conversations that we can have during these three for sure, and maybe more if we need to have the dialogues. So thank you so much for coming. It's super important, and I think it's a long time coming, this type of a dialogue. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Cynthia. One thing I definitely want to touch on when we're getting into a lot of this content here is one of the main components of the dialogues is webcasting. So we're aware not everybody can be with us here in LA on our first, our first meeting here. We have the next two that will also be webcasting. So with that, let's engaging in the dialogue or just sharing something. Please make sure to project, which I will try to mirror for you as well. The camera is right over here, so I will be. This is the space here. This is where everybody will be watching. As of now, people will be joining and seeing me, but I will make sure to direct the camera in your direction when you're sharing. So please be mindful of that so we can project. And I think that is, if you feel you would like to be shown or recorded, please let me know, and I will make sure to not have you shown here in the webcast. So to move right along, I also would like to, thank you for the space. I did want to acknowledge Lucy will join us later, but now moving on, I will go ahead and kick it off to Ana Mascareñas, the Assistant Director of Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs.
Thank you, Amanda, very much. So Ingrid and I are going to be co-facilitating parts of this meeting. My name is Ana Mascareñas, Assistant Director for EJ and Tribal Affairs at DTSC. We really, really appreciate spending your Saturday today on this important dialogue. So I think first off, I want to actually introduce that Lázaro Cárdenas will be also facilitating and helping us make sure that we're aware of time and that we are able to answer people's questions and get to the parts of the dialogue that we've worked together to plan. So with that, I think we're just going to do around the horseshoe introductions. If you could share your name and share your name and how you found yourself here this morning. Spend time with us on this community dialogue. After that, we'll go over. We have some presentations that will be short, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows who's in the room. We'll talk about community agreements and safe space for today. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ingrid, my co-facilitator. Okay.
My name is Ingrid Brostrom. I'm an attorney with the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. And I come to this dialogue because I was get this name wrong. I was a member of the Hazardous Waste Reduction Initiative Advisory Committee, where we talked about different methodologies of reducing the total amount of hazardous waste in California. This was one of the pilots that we worked on, recognizing that we needed to bring community into the decision making when we try to figure out what do we do with all of this contaminated soil, which we'll find out later is one of the largest sources of hazardous waste in California. So I wanted to bring in the community piece of it because I think it's really important. So I'm very excited to be here and to kick off this first meeting.
Hi everyone, my name is Xenia Villanueva and I'm a member of the People's Senate. I also served on the committee, Community Protection, Hazardous Waste Reduction Committee, lengthy name, and that led us here. We've been working together, a group of us, to coordinate this meeting and the next two that will follow. And I myself am a former resident of the Autumnwood community in Wildomar that was the subject of contaminated soil that was trucked in, and many people in my community, including myself and my family, became ill. And this is my daughter Alexandra. I'll introduce you to her.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Monica Shankar. I work with Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, PSRLA report. We are an organization that's also a member of the Georgetown Environmental Justice Coalition, which is located in Watts here in Los Angeles. The reason we're engaged in this conversation is because in that site there is a massive redevelopment and there was a massive remediation. We're still concerned that that site in particular may be contaminated with particular heavy metals such as lead, arsenic, and cadmium. And then since our engagement there about, I want to say, the earliest about 8 years ago, we've also started having conversations with other folks across Watts, including some really great base building organizations such as the Watts Labor Community Action Committee. And we're wondering if the problem is more widespread than we originally thought and could potentially be all across Watts, which is a highly disadvantaged communities. According to Cal Virus Screen, the visual census tracts are located at 5%, top 5% most disadvantaged communities. One of our goals as a committee, as a coalition, the Georgetown Environmental Justice Coalition, is to make sure that we are working very closely with communities and we're co-powering those communities to make sure that they have a space at a decision-making table so that they're able to guide the transformation of their community. And so we think that these kinds of spaces are incredibly important because we want to make sure that they guide the transformation of their community ultimately.
My name is Linda Cleveland, and I'm the Watts Air and Energy Committee that meets at St. John's Church in collaboration with the Sierra Club. And I also have been talking to former residents of the Georgetown development, and they're telling me about the issues that they've had prior to this new project that's going on that have never been resolved. So they think that the land that the units currently sit on are still full of toxic substances. So I'm just here to listen, really.
My name is Yvonne Martinez-Watson. I'm a member of the Sierra Club, and I'm here today also on behalf of the Angeles Chapter Sierra Club, a brand new Environmental Justice Committee. I learned about this through my work in Boyle Heights with the community there that is dealing with the excess battery pipeline and the lead contaminated soil that they believe is affecting 10,000 homes in around the city of Bristol. That's how I got involved also in the city of Montebello where I live. We have an oil field and there's a proposal to put 1,200 homes in the middle of that field. And they're thinking of removing, I think it's 6 million cubic feet of dirt. And that would be contaminated and they'll have to take it somewhere. So I'm here to find out where in the world we think they're going to take this. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Verdina Sewell. I'm the Executive Director of California Safe Schools, and we're a children's environmental health and environmental justice coalition. And I had the honor of attending one of their meetings, and it was really impressive, and I'm glad that they're continuing. There are a lot of schools and communities adjacent to schools that have a tremendous amount of hazardous waste. And so I'm very interested in hearing about solutions and alternatives to taking this hazardous waste to other communities and just see what we can all come up with. So thank you.
My name is Jesse Marcus. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition for a Safe Environment. We're headquartered in Wilmington. We have members in over 25 different cities. Our main areas of focus are ports, freight transportation, and the petroleum industry. And over the years, we found out wherever you find a port, wherever you find a freight transportation corridor, and wherever there's been anything related to the petroleum industry, they've always been contaminated sites. And so basically, we do a lot of public comment research in that regard. In fact, even one time, I got a call that from a railroad track, there was the people that were fence line to it, saying that, you know, we've been watching these trucks bringing in this dirt, and it didn't bother us, except for now the dirt is like 2 mountains high, and even that didn't quite bother us until we saw the men in the little blue spacesuits. And that's why we're calling, you know, because now we're nervous because we think it's contaminated or something. And sure enough, it was. It was actually contaminated soil from the Alameda corridor that had been stored somewhere else, and they were trucking it there. And so you know, if they did violate the law. The city of LA, they had a little gentleman's memorandum of agreement with the railroad, the corridor. Oh yeah, you can put it here and you can do it that. But they bypassed the public process. We have to have public hearing to transport anything. So those are the type of things that all they can get into.
My name is Lana Perez. I'm a part of the organization for a safe environment. That's all I can say.
Cynthia Babs, Roma Action Committee.
Hi guys, my name is Jorge Nuevo. I'm a prior Automobile resident, and I'm a current member of the Senate, the People's Senate. I'm an effective citizen of Riverside County, and I'm here because I want to be part of the solution. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marcia Rubin. I'm the Public Participation Manager in Chatsworth office. We have the largest team of public participation specialists in the state. We handle a lot of the sensitive projects. So one of our main goals in the Office of Public Participation is to bring the community voices to the table. And so that's what I'm doing.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jill Johnston. I'm a professor at the University of Southern California in the Division of Environmental Health. And I work collaboratively with communities to look at soil contamination, air contamination, and other sources of exposure and what that means for health impacts.
And they're a member of the Impact Project.
Yes.
They trade out and learn.
My name is Ajit Vaidya. I'm with DTSC Sacramento Regional Office, and I will be giving one of the talks today. So,
I'm Steve Becker. I'm also with DTSC from Sacramento. I've been involved in this effort, and I will be giving a presentation at the next meeting.
I'm Jean Williams, I'm Director of California Communities and Topics.
I'm Roger Kintz, and I'm Southern California Environmental Justice Coordinator and currently run the Workforce for Environmental Restoration in Communities program.
Hello again, I'm Amanda Dominguez, Public Participation Specialist with the department. And
hi all, my name is Lázaro. I'm Lázaro Laz. I'm with DTSC's Office of Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs. You've probably seen my email many times.
Yeah.
My name is Lida Musabian. I'm not representing this particular group.
Hi, good morning. I'm Mohsen Nazemi, Deputy Director with DTSC for the Site Mitigation and Cleanup Program. I'm actually based down here in Southern California, so I see a lot of you in a lot of events, and I want to welcome you to this meeting. I have staff in Southern and Northern California, so I also visit Sacramento a lot. And unfortunately today, we have to, because my wife, we have to go to the funeral, so I will not be able to stay with you the whole day, but I look forward to having dialogue with you throughout this program. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, everyone. So before we launch into kind of the meat of the program today, we did want to set forth some community agreements. Since we want this to be really open, we want to spur really good dialogues and capture it today. But we also recognize that this is a difficult issue, especially if we're talking about burden shifting from one community to another, or cleanup sites versus host hazardous waste facility host sites. So we did want to make sure that we can have as open a dialogue as possible while still respecting a lot of potentially different opinions. So we want to do this in a collaborative way. I could start with maybe just a couple of suggestions and then open it up to see if folks have any other suggestions that we should agree to before we move into more of the meat. So I'll just throw out a couple. One is we agree that this is a safe space for conversation. That could mean using respectful language, no foul language, no choking your neighbor. People agree to people agree that they should be a shared agreement? Yes. Another is that people have the right to express ideas and ask questions, but also have a responsibility to welcome other ideas and questions. People okay with that agreement? People agree to that? Three is we have intentionally, a lot of this is going to be dialoguing, with allowing people to share ideas and thoughts. And we have not put time limits because I think that really tends to stymie conversation. And also it seems very bureaucratic, and that's something that we're all very familiar with when we deal with DTSC and other agencies. So we would like not to do any kind of time limits, but we do ask that collectively we respect the agenda and that we really do try to move through the entire thing. So if we see ourselves perhaps taking up a lot more time than everyone else, agree to step back so that we can make it through everything. Do we agree to that? And then finally, just that we'd like to all acknowledge that it's okay to have differing opinions and perspectives, and that we likely will hear differing opinions and perspectives, and that's okay, and that's actually going to create better conversations and better outcomes in the end. So those are the ones that I have. Would anyone else like to suggest any?
I think a good one would be just to make sure that we're all being respectful of one another and not talking over one another, not interrupting one another, and let people finish their complete thoughts. Obviously, like you indicated, maybe put the opinion, but allow someone to express themselves fully, and then at that point you can engage.
If I can just suggest to like, because I think that some of these conversations are heavy because there are folks in the room who experience it on a day-to-day basis, don't misinterpret the passion for anger perhaps. It's just that I think people are affected by it and have been for a very long time. And so it comes out perhaps in a much more passionate way. So don't take it personally.
Don't take it personally.
Maybe, yes, if that captures it, then yes.
Also, don't mistake passion for anger.
Yeah.
Don't mistake passion for anger.
Well, and even if there is anger, that's okay.
And with respect to their voice, I also took that to meeting. Yes, this is we're doing webcasts at the same time, but just to be aware of one speaker at a time. And have all your facilitators to help know if you want to join in, but one speaker at a time.
Anything else?
I think we had one or two people come in the room since introductions. So, Florence, would you like to introduce yourself?
Glad to be here. Believe me.
What's your name?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do you want to say
Florence
which org?
Caribbean, with chair of the Del Amo Action Committee and previously manager of DTSC. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you.
So if we can all agree to the shared agreements, I'm going to pass it over to Anna to kick off on why we're here.
Right. Thank you. We have a short presentation to kind of give some background context. Today, you've heard from community partners around the table, a little bit about how this dialogue came to be and what our goals and objectives are today. And you have the printout of the short slides. It's just the overview of the community dialogue on the management of contaminated soil. So I'll jump in, and folks on the webcast can also join in. But I basically just wanted to share that this dialogue grew out of community protection and hazardous waste reduction initiative. So this was a 2-year initiative undertaken by the department, and we asked for volunteers and formed an advisory committee of which Ingrid, Zonia, and Cynthia were a part of. From July 2015 to 2017, we met with the goal of developing, implementing, and evaluating methods to reduce hazardous waste treated, generated, and disposed of in California. Throughout the project, there were really good discussions had about how we should either focus in or broaden those goals, but really the focus is to reduce hazardous waste generation. And one of the pilots really wanted to focus in on how community input is considered in the decision-making around contaminated soil. So there were 4 pilot project proposals in the end, looking at major waste streams of hazardous waste in California, petroleum refinery waste, lead acid batteries, organic solvent waste, and contaminated soil. And my colleagues are going to jump into a more in-depth presentation of contaminated soil right after this. But just for the next slide, just to give a brief idea, this is 2016 contaminated soil from site cleanup compared to other hazardous wastes. And you can take a look and see that it is about 36% of the hazardous waste in California as it's tracked from site cleanup. And that is the largest waste stream for the state. Next slide, please. Again, the emphasis of the community dialogue, why we're all here today, is on community input and decision-making for cleanup of contaminated soil. Developing this dialogue in partnership with the community representatives on the committee, and we really focused in on this project right after the initiative ended and through this year through this series of dialogues.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Is contaminated soil always considered hazardous waste?
No. So that's a, yeah, I'm going to ask Ajit to dig into that a little bit more on the next presentation. That's a very good question. So the community dialogue goals, this was in the invitation that we extended to everyone to participate in this 3-part dialogue, clarifying the basis for various community perspectives on how to handle contaminated soil, providing a greater understanding of the technical options for managing contaminated soil, and the potential benefits and drawbacks. That topic in particular is going to be the next meeting, and then developing guidelines for the roles of communities in DTSC's decision-making processes. We talked a lot about how this information, next slide please, of how this information is shared, and wanting to make sure that the time that you're investing, that you're spending with us, that you know the plan to be able to take all the outcomes and the information today that we're taking this in at DTSC in affecting change. Next slide please. So after the 3-part dialogue, the last one is in December, we're creating a report, an action plan, and we're going to work with Director Lee, who actually wants to extend her apologies for not being here today. She has been involved in the planning of this dialogue and really wishes she could be here today. So we'll be taking the report and outcomes to the director, to the management. We have the director of the cleanup program here, and with your feedback, talking about the outcomes of this dialogue. We will also be sharing with community members across the state. Just want to make sure to mention that is an extremely important part of, as we're asking everyone to spend their time here, that the outcomes of this dialogue are shared. And within DTSC, we'll be evaluating developing timeframes for any potential programmatic changes, how we're going to incorporate what's shared here today. That includes partnering with community members in the regions across the state, to talk about the community dialogue and information that is generated. Next slide, please. So early on, we talked about defining success for this dialogue. And this information was developed with the community partners, what we really are aiming towards. And throughout the process of everyone participating today, we can talk about how this is developed. But a written set of shared principles that will help guide and inform DTSC decision-making. So understanding the scope of contaminated soil, and then hearing your perspectives on how communities can best be involved and how we can do that differently. That's one outcome of defining success. A very specific part that we talked about is proposing guidelines for factoring and weighting community input. There are a number of existing processes in place to gather community input, and the public participation program, and many of you have worked closely with DTSC and other agencies that oversee cleanups. There are a number of steps in place for public participation, and community input, but we'd like to hear back and create some guidelines together on how it's considered, and if we're missing something, how we can actually address that. And the last bullet here is a common understanding of the benefits and costs of various treatment and disposal alternatives. This includes a lot of information about technical options, and today, of course, is just the overview. But we wanted to, one of the bases of having this dialogue is so that we can actually talk and have our technical experts and community experts all together to better understand what the benefits and drawbacks are of some of these technologies. So for today, since this is meeting number 1, we are hoping to accomplish together a shared understanding of the goals and desired outcomes of the community dialogue. Again, this is meeting 1 of 3 meetings, and then a shared understanding of the scope of managing contaminated soil in California. Last slide. Here's information on the next 2 meetings. The next topic will be in Delano on Tuesday, November 14th, and we'll be talking about environmental laws governing soil cleanups, and also the DTSC decision-making process for remedy selection. The 3rd and last meeting of the series is December 2nd, talking about community's involvement in decision making. And some of these topics are going to be covered in the overview, but we're really going to get into more details and have background information there. And then the technical approaches for handling contaminated soil. So we would like to thank our hosts today, the Global Action Committee and the People's Senate, and we have hosts as well, co-host organizations for those next two meetings. And because we designed this together to be a dialogue that builds, if anyone here would like to participate in the next two dialogues, and because we are having them across the state, please let us know if you require assistance for traveling to participate in the dialogue, because we want to make sure that people have the ability to access being part of this conversation, not only for the first meeting, but for the second and the third. So please just let us know. That's it for me for now. Any questions?
So are you saying to provide transportation?
Yes, we're providing, and I'm going to ask you, Lázaro is the point person for transportation assistance, but we want to make sure that we have some ability to support people participating in the dialogue, since it is an advisory panel basically that we're creating here. And so if you'd like to participate in Delano and or Oakland, please talk to us.
We'll figure out the details, so just talking afterwards, and especially if you want to go to the Delano one, which is about 2.5 weeks, let me know as soon as possible, and we'll work with you.
And we hope everybody will, take advantage of that. I'm sorry to go away from home, but I think it's a really important conversation to have. And thank you to DTSC for providing that support. It's really essential.
The November 14th meeting is only like a couple hours long, 2.5 hours long.
Mm-hmm.
So is there going to be adequate time for people to actually converge there, because you've got two presentations?
That's something we've been talking about. And I think actually Cynthia did mention at the beginning that we are, this is the plan for as a 3-part dialogue. We are going to have information available beforehand to try and set the stage, but that is a consideration of how long that meeting is. It's a challenge because we wanted to also have it in the evening on a weekday to provide different times for people to participate. So 2 Saturdays and 1 weekday. But that's a good point you're bringing up. We, maybe providing some feedback on how the presentation, the technical presentation goes today, if it covers the right amount of information. We're hoping these presentations cover a lot, but we would like them to be short, about 15 minutes, to give an overview and then spark dialogue.
And, well, those 2 presentations are also going to be webcast, is that correct?
Yes.
Just like today, so I mean, can't make it in person, that's also going to be an option, correct?
Yes, webcast is an option. I don't know the details off the bat, but I know that webcast is an option for the second meeting as well.
Well, can I make a suggestion?
Mm-hmm.
Because the environmental laws governing soil cleanup, although gripping to some of us, may not be quite as, exciting to others. So not that you would want to go through that, but maybe you could do a workshop a little bit earlier in the day for like some people, will go. And you could do it in a more informal way, and then people that have questions about like environmental laws and soil cleanup could really get into it. You know what I mean?
That's a good idea.
And then you could maybe focus. You could do a short presentation on environmental laws governing cleanup, but then you could kind of focus it, because really the meat of that meeting is the decision-making process. I think those of us sitting around the table understand that the laws are not the impediment. The laws actually are pretty clear and pretty well thought out, but it's the decision-making process itself that is the problem, that is problematic and needs to be really vetted out. So I'm just putting that forward. Maybe that's something we can think about. Like if you scheduled it like at 4, there's a bunch of us from LA and we'll all get in the van and go up there, and we could sit and grill your, I don't know if you can do that presentation, but we
Sit to your left.
No, we can bring pizza here. So get into that rimming underselling environmental laws and everything.
Your comment is very well taken, and I think that helps me understand when I'm putting together my presentation, because I understand that the laws are pretty well known to most individuals, and I will certainly try and tailor my presentation, but we will talk internally about what makes the most sense and how that can work. But I'm flexible to whatever is agreed upon, and I will try not to make it too dry as far as the laws go.
Well, you get a medal for that.
I'm trying to keep it focused on the material you're interested in, I guess. And Yeah, so any input I
Trying to make
have today.
the laws governing hazardous waste soil disposal not dry will be an amazing feat.
Thank you for the suggestion, Jane.
So-
I want to make sure that we are noting community feedback and suggestions up here in real time. So we're going to take that back, and our co-host for that meeting is also Center for Race, Poverty and Environment. So we're going to look back.
That would be great. So I'm sure some of us would love to know more about and figure it out, but that doesn't have to be like a big community meeting. It's more sort of a, not that we don't want to cover it. I would cover it like in a more chunky version.
Thank you.
Since you're doing a live webcast, would it be possible to do it, or it could be an interactive one for the people that can't make it to the meeting, that they could just submit online comments as you're going through that way they can participate from home?
Yes, we're going to note that as well. I think our goal is to do that. We're trying to figure out technically and staff-wise how to make that happen. So I think for today's webcast, it's pretty much just listening in. And so I'm hearing the suggestion of we could have a way for people to submit comments either by email and then have them read, or else if we can do an actual live interactive webcast, that would be more, that would allow more people to participate, right?
Right, because I participated where you can do actual messaging as the webcast is going along.
Okay.
Right, that would be so simple to do.
It is.
Like even, it's going to be at CRPE, just even like send an email to, we can just read it, or questions or.
Well, Zoom allows it to be interactive, and we do that almost every month with some coalition group. Where you're at a desktop or your laptop or your tablet.
Okay, that's a good idea.
Well, that is the goal.
That is the goal. Did you want to share something?
Well, Alexander said, Mom, you can do Facebook Live. I don't know if that is true.
Facebook Live, let's put that up there.
I agree with Jane about the importance of the second meeting to cover decision-making process more than just the laws. But I also want to point out that the third meeting is really where the community's involvement in decision-making is going to be, again, discussed. So we do believe that is an important part of this dialogue, and so we want to devote at least 2 sessions to that.
Well, one of the points I always bring up too is, not spending so much time reinventing the wheel, so that, in preparation for the next 2 upcoming meetings, to have, if we're talking about, making information available, and we're talking about very sophisticated, complicated, technical, legal type information, it's very difficult for an average person to understand. But if we can do some homework and look for examples of brochures and flyers, newsletters, and things of that nature, so we have some examples as to, what would be a good way to recollect information. And I actually have an example. Just yesterday, I was driving back to my office, and as I was parking, there was a white van that said environmental enforcement on it. I'd never seen one before. And 2 men get out of it in their uniforms, and a neighbor had filed a complaint about oil in the gutter and driveway because there's an automotive repair right there on the corner. And since I never saw him, I asked him, well, do you have a business card, He says, no, but we have a brochure. And he hands me this little brochure here. They're mostly into, spill type things, And so this is focused on that. But this little 2-pager, has, like contact information on it. It was bilingual English and Spanish, and had photos and illustrations and descriptions of the things that they investigate. And this was so simple. I go, wow, this is fantastic. In fact, I forgot about that. I'm now right now to get it because I wanted to show it to you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's helpful. There's, when you were coming in, I believe there's some examples. We made copies of the Superfund Citizen Guide kind of overview. So I just want to note that we've been working to create a community participant guide to the whole dialogue, especially since so much of this information is dense. And so that's still in the works. We want to have it available for the next meeting beforehand, but it kind of not quite in the trifold brochure, a little bit longer, but we're trying to find the balance between information people can have as a resource book and kind of go back to, and we hope to have that for the second meeting. But that's something that we've gotten feedback so far from the community participants, and we're trying to make it a little less dense, but still provide the information. So any other examples you have, Jesse, please share with us. A couple of the one-pagers we've made copies of. If you feel like some of those are in particular helpful, let us know. Anything else before we move into the overall presentation around, or a background on contaminated soil, and the next from Jane and from Jill to give us some other perspectives on health impacts. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. I would like to welcome Ajit Vaida. Ajit, as you mentioned earlier, works out of our Sacramento Health Center office. And it's going to provide a bit of background about what he does in the department and then the overall scope of contaminated soil as we're sharing today with the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So good to be here with all of you. As Anna mentioned, my name is Ajit Vaidya. I'm unit supervisor in the Engineering and Special Projects Office of DTSC cleanup program. I am also an civil and environmental engineer. And, one of the things I heard earlier in our community share was about passion. I just want to share with you that one of the reasons I got into the field that I'm in is because I'm also very passionate about the environment, and that's something that kind of guided me throughout my college and in my career. So it's really important to me, and so I'm really happy to be here. Okay, so also as I mentioned, this topic is going to sort of build on the next few meetings as well. So I'm just going to sort of set the table, and so hopefully I can help inform you of some of the basics of soil contamination in the state. But first of all, I wanted to tell you a little bit about DTSC, and our mission is to protect the people and the environment from the harmful effects of toxic substances. And our mission statement includes 4 subcategories: restoring contaminated resources. That's what we're talking about there is site cleanup. And then enforcing hazardous waste laws. That's supported by our permitting and enforcement programs. And then reducing hazardous waste generation and encouraging the manufacture of chemically safer products. That's supported by our safer consumer products program. So we have sort of 3 main core programs that feed into this mission. I'm part of the cleanup program, which is the first bullet you saw there. We are primarily responsible for overseeing cleanup and restoration of contaminated sites. There's all kinds of contaminated sites throughout the state, but the main media that we look at are soil contamination, soil vapor, and groundwater contamination. And it's really important to know that they're sort of all interconnected. There's contamination in the ground that kind of can also become part of indoor air contamination. They also feed into the groundwater. So they're all kind of connected, but we're going to focus on soil contamination. Oh, can you go back for a second? And one important point that I want to also mention is that we're a regulatory agency, and so we regulate and oversee what we call responsible parties, if hear that term, who are liable for site contamination and cleanup. So it's really important that DTSC is engaging and making sure that those who are liable for the contamination are doing their job in doing the cleanup. So that's a big responsibility on our part. Next slide, please. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the types of site cleanups that we do. We do voluntary cleanups in brownfields, which is when people might be redeveloping a site and there's contamination. They have to do a cleanup associated with that so they can build on the property. Corrective action, which is another type of cleanup, federal and state Superfund. You have federal facilities and military sites where the responsible party in that case is could be the Department of Defense or another federal agency. And we have schools program where we are overseeing cleanup at school sites. And there's another component which is, for the most part, we do responsible party work, but there's another category called orphan sites, we call them, which is where we can't identify a responsible party. And in that case, we do have some limited funding to self-manage the cleanups, but that's a smaller portion. Next slide, please. So, yeah.
So do you have, does DTSC take the same stance on oversight with all of those different categories, like voluntary cleanup sites versus the federal Superfund site? Do you have the same role, consistent role throughout that process, or are there differences?
I mean, there's going to be some slight differences, and part of that's what we're going to get into in Steve's presentation in the second meeting. But I mean, the thing is, when there's a voluntary cleanup, it's a little bit different because there's different kinds of agreements that we have. We're not going to do some kind of a unilateral order against somebody. Whereas if there's a responsible party that's not cooperating, we have to do, we might have to do some kind of enforcement, or we have to do a unilateral order. Whereas voluntary cleanups are more cooperative. But by and large, our role is to make sure that the cleanups are being performed in accordance with the laws and regulations. Steve, you want to add something?
Yeah, so the basic cleanup process that's followed is similar for each one of these. It's almost identical. It's just a matter of, based on the complexity of the site, you may have some additional documents that you prepare to evaluate certain remedies, that sort of thing. But the basic flow of, investigation through the completion of the cleanup is in essence the same for each of these categories. And I'll explain the nuances in the next meeting for each one of those.
Okay, well, so what I would like to say is there is a big difference between voluntary cleanup and Superfund site cleanup. And those distinctions really need to be made and brought to light because, part of the letter that I handed out, and this is the document on the ECI site in my community, that was a voluntary cleanup site on a Superfund site. So they can get very complicated. And what we found is that because it was a voluntary site, there wasn't the oversight that we would have liked the agency to have. There was mismanagement of soil. It blew all of our community. We had to constantly remain vigilant in making phone calls to keep the soil files covered. Luckily, with working with the agency, it got pushed back into the EPA where it belonged for the whole time. But in the meantime, the problem had happened. And so that was my first time of ever having anything to do with a voluntary cleanup site since I live in a Superfund world, not fund. And so that really needs to be, that's something that we really need to get at. And so that we make sure that if they're going to have pay for oversight, which I guess is another way to put it, that actually happens. And that there's a caveat that goes to the community that the agency takes responsibility for, because the responsible parties are not going to do that. And they did not do that in this case. So I only gave you 3 pages, but this is where the 3 pages came out of. In most communities, I mean, who, like Jane said, not too many people crawl up at night with the warm, fuzzy work on. I do, but not many people do. So can we keep thinking about those distinctions?
Yes, I think what I'm understanding is, and what I'm talking about is the general flow as far as how the process of evaluating the site is concerned is consistent through each of those processes. I think what you're talking about is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that with respect to the level of oversight, your feeling is that the voluntary site didn't get the level of oversight that a federal Superfund site would have received.
Yes,
am I saying that?
The voluntary site, in my opinion, with this one horrible site we have, gets the box checked.
Okay.
Boxes checked. The other ones actually get oversight. There's course corrections during the process.
Yes, we were going to say this, and we really want to capture that so important and recognize that there may be different recommendations for different types of projects.
level of oversight between voluntary sites versus others. All the other ones are basically mentioned on there.
Well, it's not just voluntary versus others. I mean, each one of these sites has a different statutory underpinning. It has a different type of oversight, and depending on which staff you have and which experts the staff has, you have a different oversight. And so really every single one of these, like the process is not the same. I can guarantee you. You know, like Robina and I worked on the Carson War School, where basically it was, we're going to leave stuff in place and build a school on top of it, despite legislation that prohibited that. So there's not one of these programs that I can't point to that you don't have like major problems, and those problems come in at every different part of what would be called a process that was originally designed to stop that from happening. And that's not in the past. Like, you know, we're working on a site right now where the department is proposing to leave behind hexavalent chromium and build a park on top of it next to an elementary school. So these are not problems that used to happen. These are problems that happen now. And that's one of the fundamental problems with the architecture, is that the fact that you have voluntary cleanups, that you have brownfields. Brownfields is like biosolids. Brownfields is a greenwashing term for a what? A contaminated site. It's completely arbitrary what a brownfield is and what a contaminated site is. I mean, most of your brownfield sites fall under RCRA corrective action authorities. There's not a separate authority, right? I mean, there's CLARA, but that doesn't have to do with the cleanup itself. That has to do with how the liability is parsed out. So even though, I didn't finish, even the language the department uses itself, the paradigm it embraces, it obscures the underpinnings of what the department's supposed to do, which is it's supposed to ensure that a site is safe when you leave. And that's what's not happening over and over and over again. And all of this sort of obscures that. It's like the department, I think like the department staff feels like as long as we've gone through this process, then the site is safe and we leave. But we all know on the ground that that's not happening. So I just want to say, like, just the very fact that you have to list all this stuff is like, wait a minute. It's all basically the same problem. You have contamination in soils, in groundwater, and in soil gas, and the department doesn't really know how to clean it up and doesn't leave a clean site. And that all of this sort of obscures that. So I just want to throw that out there.
Appreciate your comment, Jane. I wanted to take the other questions for hands that are raised, but also that we are hoping to, there's a couple more slides. I think the intention was to give a background on how the department is set up, but I'm hearing very strong feedback about community feedback around the level of oversight for cleanup overall, and if it differs or how it differs for each of these types of cleanups, and how it's organized right now. And then just an overall making sure that we talk about the process the department goes through for the different kinds, even if they're are the same or different legal underpinnings. So I saw Jesse's hand and I saw Florence's hand as well. And then I'm going to suggest, unless anyone has a further clarifying question on this slide, that we move on to the next slide. Jesse?
Contaminated land, hazardous land, materials on land are like one of my weakest areas of knowledge and expertise. And so when I have to begin to learn something new, then I have to also realize that, I've heard stories of other situations, like from Cynthia, Robina, and Jane, so I know that. Then I have to think back to myself, okay, what is my situation? And then what benefits me or what can help me understand. And so when I see categories like this, I have to begin to think, okay, there are laws, there are regulations, there's policies and procedures that I'm not that familiar with. I don't need a 50-page book to tell me that. I can use a two-sided 8.5 by 11 sheet that says, here's this law, this policy, this program, and describes it. So I have a basic understanding. That's what I want, is a basic understanding. But at the same time, there's this thing called the public right to know. Okay, so in that public right to know, I want to know several things. If it falls into a category, then I want to know what that category is. I want to know what is that substance. I want to be able to learn from lessons from the past as well. And when I hear stories that a school district is going forward or building a new school on top of a contaminated site, whether it's cleaned up or not, or to what degree, that is the major concern. Because the question comes up in my mind, well, how is that allowed? So are you telling me that DTSC can be bypassed? The school district says we're going to go forward. Where does the buck stop? Okay. That's what I need to know as a parent, as a resident. You know, if the school board's going to approve it and you can't stop it, who can stop it? Okay. And in my public right to know, then what needs to be done, or what is not happening in this world that's happening in other worlds. And the other world, for example, is Prop 65. Prop 65 that says that you have chemicals known to cause cancer. So when I go to a business, I see that sign, and over years, I'm familiar with what that is. Okay? Then it makes me question, well, wait a minute. Why hasn't DTSC sponsored a law that says contaminated land site, that's like here, you know, so that if I'm purchasing a home and the home was built on top of a former oil well field, then there are real estate laws, and I know real estate realtors are supposed to disclose certain things, but they disclose, oh, well, it needs to be termited, fumigated. Well, that's one thing. But when they're not disclosing that it was built on top of an oil well field, that's serious. So I want to know what law covers that. And if there is no law covering that, then my request would be to DTSC, then we need to make that law.
Thank you. I want to make sure we're capturing, there's two main points I think that I heard and want to make sure we're capturing. One is around materials, or if you're, it's a new subject, that we have materials that doesn't have to be long, but that concisely captures what kind of policy or laws we're talking about. Something simple, 2-pager, to help people understand what exactly it is we're talking about. And then public right to know around substances that are found at sites, and then also around disclosure. What is the public's right to know and disclose that information? Does that capture what you were?
Yes, because even like right now, well, most of you heard about Carson Carousel Homes. There's 295 homes built on top of a former petroleum facility. And what I have learned, because in Wilmington, we have oil well fields throughout the Harbor and South Bay areas, that the vapor intrusion after 20, 25, 30 years, that's when it gets discovered. Okay? Well, we should have to be exposed for 25, 30 years to find out there's been vapor intrusion happening. You know, if there had been a proper, public disclosure in purchasing the property that, hey, it was a former site, then, before I buy that property, I want to know who's checking it every so often to make sure that they did do the cleanup. Because I'm finding out that whatever cleanup they did, it was never adequate. And in some cases, wasn't even inadequate. They still left the tanks there. It turned out to be 30 years later, they find it,
So real estate disclosure, timing of disclosure, and then also what was the final outcome of the cleanup.
Yes.
Okay. And I could ask Florence, and then we can move on to the next
Okay.
part.
I'll start by saying I was in the department when the Superfund program in the state of California was created. And I was in the room where everybody tried to figure out how to even do all of this. So I have that background. The statement's being made that the basic process of investigating and then determining cleanup levels and then cleaning it up is basically the same. I would suspect is probably the case. But what we found at ECI was some really interesting things, because what it looked like was there was a standard format you submitted to DTSC, if you wanted to clean up your site, and if you didn't have a project manager that was really very well informed or didn't have the time or wasn't interested, you could have things in that cleanup plan like the possibility of taking DDT contaminated soil to a site that treats petroleum waste. And those two things are not the same at all. And you could use a PID to figure out whether or not through field observations there was any DDT in the soil. Well, PID doesn't detect DDT in the soil. And so we went through and identified these problems. And when I became aware of the fact that there was a basic format that apparently might be rubber stamped a little bit too easily, is when I looked at the Jordan Downs cleanup plan and discovered it was the same language with the same disposal facilities and all the things I'm talking about with DCI. So having a structure for the work to be done is all well and good and very necessary. But the discretion of the project manager as to whether or not they adequately tap into what it is they're supposed to be looking at is where I think you can start running into real problems. And I'll mention something I also know, which is when the voluntary cleanup program came online at DTSC, the focus was on how do we solve our financial problems at DTSC? And the idea was that people would begin to pay for things they hadn't been paying for before. The voluntary cleanup program comes into existence. And the basic problem with it was then, they didn't hire any more staff. They didn't get any more resources to do the voluntary cleanup program. So the guy doing the federal Superfund side was also trying to manage a voluntary cleanup site. So my bottom line is the structure may be there, but the discretion of the project manager is something that can take that very structured process and make it something that doesn't work at all. So that's the comment.
Sorry, that's multitasking, but so capturing Lawrence's feedback, concern around the discretion of the project manager or the project decisions, meaning the cleanup and including disposal of waste. Okay.
And the other thing I'll mention is the way we found out about ECI was not because Cynthia got a notice about what was going on, because she didn't get any notice. But Ravina got a notice, and she told us about it. And I got the feeling, although I'm not gonna say that anybody was guilty of this, but maybe you could do this if Cynthia didn't know anything about it. So by the time we got the notice, the public comment period had expired, and we had to step back in line and persuade them to accept our comments. So
making sure that public notices are getting to people who are interested, who have this interested in the project, especially the community at large, but I think to capture up there that
and
public notices are being distributed.
The idea was, well, we sent it to a quarter mile to all the people that lived there.
Mm-hmm.
But do you live there? No,
No, but I'm on for any kind of notice. I've signed up for everything. And it doesn't mean that I always get them either, you know, but I have signed up for everything.
This is really good feedback. We were actually talking a little bit before the meeting started about the physical letters that the department sends out and notices, and then also our electronic notification system. So we're going to take this feedback and talk about how that's currently set up. And I'll ask Marcia to step in that conversation too. But I think I want to just make sure it's out there, how we are noticing people, make sure that they know what list they're signed up for and they're getting information that they're asking for. So yeah, then we'll move on to.
So it's not that we don't want the agency to get paid for the work that they're doing, but we also want, if the agency is going to be involved, that they bring along with them the public participation and those kind of skills and not leave it up to the responsible party to do, because what I'm also hearing is the same argument that we have about risk assessments. It has to do with the assessor. And so the same with the project manager. So it's not like, dinging you for not getting paid, but really getting a handle on what are you guys bringing to the table. People may or may not know, they probably know that down here in LA, sometimes the authority gets split between, either DTSC or the State Water Board. And so, making sure that there's some consistency in that, which I think is getting better, but for a long time, we knew that responsible parties were shopping for the, least oversight that they could get. And so, this is going to be like a work in progress, but also what Jesse was talking about, this is part of what we're trying to do, not just have a dialogue, but give people tools so that they can continue to further work on their sites. Where can I find this? Where are the tox profiles? Those kind of things, so that people can really do their own work and make sure that their families are protected and actually be an asset to the work that the agencies are doing.
So access information about the sites, including voluntary cleanup and bringing public participation and expertise on all of those sites that we're working on.
Yeah, if you do a voluntary cleanup, you guys should have brought your best stuff to the game, because I would think that you guys know who the community people are, make sure they get noticed, not just the radius as Mark said. I think a lot of harm gets done by not having that that cooperativeness between the agencies and the community up front. The soil at ECI was really actually a very small amount of contaminated soil because people didn't take it seriously. They put a lot of clean dirt down first and then dumped the contaminated soil on top, which then made the whole pile be treated as contaminated waste. And so part of what we also want to support is this idea of reducing waste. That is going to have to go somewhere to somebody's community. So that's probably going to have to still happen, but if we can minimize that and take things more seriously, that's where I think we talk about having a strong state advocate and ally keeping an eye on things.
Thank you.
So one thing I would just add to that, what I'm hearing is consistency of approach. When you talk about concern about project managers, et cetera, I would summarize it as what I'm hearing is there's concern that we don't have a consistency approach. That kind of fair.
That would be pretty much it. Nice.
Like over all the different kinds of things. So that's okay. Thank you so much. Okay, well, so we'll just move on and just wanted to give you a little bit more of an overview of DTSC and how we're set up. There's over roughly 1,000 employees in our organization, and we have a statewide presence. Our headquarters office is in Sacramento. We have 4 main regional offices, one in Berkeley, one in Sacramento, 2 in the LA area, one in Chatsworth, and one in Cypress. And then we have 2 environmental laboratories, one in Berkeley, and the other one is in Pasadena. And we have 4 smaller field offices, including one in Clovis, El Centro, San Diego, and our most recent one, which we opened up just around the corner in Commerce, which, as many of you know, is focusing on oversight of the cleanup at Exide. Next slide, please. I also wanted to point out that we are not the only department or agency that oversees cleanups in the state, and there's quite a number of sites that are overseen by federal, state, and local agencies, including on the federal side, we have the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that oversees some very large cleanups. We have the state water boards and the regional water boards, whose primary mission is protecting water quality, but they also oversee a number of site cleanups. For example, petroleum refineries, a lot of those are managed by, overseen by the water boards. And then we have what we call CUPAs, or Certified Uniform Program Agencies, I think. And an example is the County of Los Angeles Fire Department. And they tend to oversee some of the smaller cleanups, such as underground storage tank removals. So just to give you a broader picture of site cleanups throughout the state. It's really important for us to make sure that there's transparency in our process, and I know that's something that's important to all of you. We have a database called EnviroStore, where the public can learn more about what's going on at these various cleanup sites. You can go to envirostore.dtsc.ca.gov, and this was recently revamped. We've went through a process over the past year where we received public comments, and we incorporated a lot of those. And I think there was a handout I saw downstairs where you can find out what are some of the newer features. But this is a screenshot of one of the screens from EnviroStore, where you can get a map of. In this case, this is the area surrounding where we're standing right now. And so it just gives you, you can see some of the different types of cleanup that I mentioned: voluntary cleanups, federal superfund, corrective action, etc. have different color codings, and you can actually go and click on those sites that you can see are located in that area and find out more information. You can drill down and get download reports or find out about public meetings. So, this is something that it's an ongoing process. We're continuing to update this, but we most recently, about a month ago, did a pretty major update of this website. So feel free to go to that.
Can I just make one quick addition to, a lot of you are familiar with this, but I just don't think you've explicitly mentioned it yet. Cal EnviroScreen is the layer that is currently on there in EnviroStore. So that is now available to the public, all of the Cal EnviroScreen layers within the EnviroStore database. That was a request we heard, and it's now implemented.
All right.
And how would anybody who's worked on this know that if they weren't at this meeting?
So we did a public meeting, I think about 8 months ago. And so these updates just happened last month. And we have the fact sheet here, but that's a really good question, Jane. I'm going to follow up and see if we've actually notified everybody who did participate in those meetings and people on our mailing list if they received a notification about this. So because we had a public meeting, I'm assuming we would want to update everybody who was part of that, but we could also talk about communicating that more broadly. It's not just the Cal EnviroScreen update that was included. There's now a feature where previously you had to know a little more information about the site, and it was just kind of difficult to search, and now it's much easier to search and kind of autofills when you're looking at a particular community or for the name of the facility or business. So we're putting that on the feedback, make sure the public knows about these updates on EnviroStore.
Yeah, put something up on your website, send it out to the manager, because we just had to have a map made because we didn't have this. So we just had a map meeting on Thursday because we did not have Cal EnviroScreen on EnviroStore, just so you know. If we had known that, we would have been able to make the map ourselves.
I'm sorry,
I'm just saying, did you send this out to?
So we just actually had this update made for this meeting because we asked the team of, has there been a notification about it? So this is a brand new fact sheet to describe what the updates are, and we can follow up and ask that it be sent around more widely.
We would like when I can pass one out.
Yeah.
So just so you know, so over the last 5 months, we've had to pay an expert to map the metal sources that we're trying to control in the QMD. So like all the lead facilities, all the chrome platers, we're getting ready to do the metal melting facilities, So not all of those facilities are on EnviroStore, but a bunch of them are because they're generators. And the generators are on there, right?
Yeah.
So you can do a screen with the generators, and then it's going to have EnviroScreen on top of it.
And it shows actually if you dig into, if you go to each project, you can also see the specific indicators on Cal EnviroScreen and what they are for that area. So it's not just a physical overlay, it gives the environmental indicators for that specific.
What's contributing to its ranking, right?
Correct.
All right.
Yes.
I just have one quick comment, and that is for the project managers that are working with, it's sometimes very frustrating. Remember, the public is seeing documents uploaded, and hopefully if that could be to the degree possible, improve, that would be fantastic. I find myself calling often, asking if they could please upload, or they get dropped off randomly. Because this is the year.
So I know that was some of the feedback we heard about a year ago, and we can follow up on the feedback of how we're responding to that, because I think there's been, I know that there's been a process put in place for when project managers should upload what type of documents, and so we can bring that feedback as to how we're changing that.
Well, not when. It's not about when, right? It's about when. I mean, we find very often that sensitive documents never make it onto EnviroStorm, especially decision-making documents. So it's not just about when, it's about it. I mean, there's some documents that we have never seen that we would like to see
On EnviroStorm?
on EnviroStorm.
Yeah, I think we definitely heard loud and clear that each project manager or region kind of handles some of that differently, or has in the past, and so we're trying to standardize it. That's really the goal, is to make it standard, predictable, and transparent.
I mean, I think typically draft documents are not posted. You can only post something once to become final, so that may be part of it.
No, that's not the problem we're talking about.
Okay.
No, we're talking about other problems.
Okay.
Yeah. Very, very important critical decision documents in the chain of remedy selection are on highly controversial sites are often never posted.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to set up their critical remedy decision documents on EnviroStorm.
Right.
And then I'm going to ask about Jesse's hand and one more hand over here. Sonia? Jesse.
So if, for example, the Port of LA has an EIR and they disclose that there is contaminated soil and they have a site assessment report, would you be sent that document so that it gets, when you put it into your database, did you know that?
Port of LA in particular.
Well, any port,
If we're working on a project, if we have some level of oversight, and please jump in, Steve and Ajit, but if it is a document that is related to the decision making and we have an oversight of that project, then I believe it goes on first. Is that accurate?
Well, we also receive documents through SEPA where there's hazardous materials component, and we review those. We review those in a responsible agency role, not a lead agency role. And so we determine whether there's a need for us to be involved or comment on that. But those would not be uploaded because we're not the agency. However, if we are the lead on the project, then documents like that should be uploaded into the project. So if we will be.
Well, from a public perspective, and I'm looking at your EnviroStorm as a resource of information, I would want that document to be added. Because what happened, we had heard a rumor, because I'm working on a project called San Pedro Waterfront Project, where we heard a rumor that the port had done another assessment, and they refused to discuss it. Then we heard from another reliable source that says yes, they did in fact do one. So we filed a FOIA, and all of a sudden, 7 site land assessment reports were delivered. None of us knew it existed at this site. And I feel that, do we need to pass a law? Do you need to pass a regulation within your agency that when any ER comes up, and it does have that component, yes, you will update and add that to this database, regardless if you're doing a brownfield or anything, because that's something it's already a known site to begin with, whether it's on your top 100 or not, doesn't make any difference. The point is that, again, I as the public have a right to know that that documentation is not just being reviewed, it is being updated, because otherwise we didn't know there were 7 reports that have been done like in the last 5 years, and not one was disclosed to the public until we just got it. So what can make that happen?
It's a good question, and I don't have an immediate answer to that. Sometimes they may be working with their local agency on assessment and cleanup, in which case we might not even be aware of it without knowing the specifics. It's hard to really comment.
Okay, but again,
I know what you're saying about the document availability, yes.
And you are the correct agency from what I can determine and understand, how can we make that happen? Now, you may not have the answer.
Yeah, that's something we need to
I may not have the answer. I'm assuming you're gonna have a legal department. So, I'm requesting the legal department to answer that, And if it needs to have legislation, if it needs to be an update in the regulation, so that when you review it and automatically, here's the site assessment, then boom, that you just don't review it, you copy it, and you add it to the database. Well, that's what I want to see happen.
We want EnviroStore to be as comprehensive as possible, so that's a very good suggestion.
See, like right now, I have several studies that were done in the last 5 years. You won't know about it. And I know you don't know about it because we just got to be able for you. Okay.
So I want to make sure you capture the feedback. What I'm hearing is information that regardless of, or actually, that the department is lead or responsible, especially for CEQA on many projects, and some clarity and more information.
Not necessarily the lead. You don't have to be the lead. We see you as a depository.
You're the
of documents. Okay.
So the questions around if we're reviewing information related to a project, that we be as transparent and provide as much information as possible on EnviroStore.
Yes, and if you're doing a review with EIR, a supplemental EIR, a subsequent EIR, an addendum EIR, that if a shelf pops up, boom.
And I just want to add to that, I mentioned some of the other agencies that oversee it. I don't know about that particular site. If it's a site that's a refinery, for example, it's overseen by the water board, it may or may not be in EnviroStore, but it would be in the water board's database, which is called GeoTracker. So there might be also some of that going on. Not everything is going to be on DTSC's database.
I couldn't quite hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know it's kind of a little bit backtracking, but I was thinking about with regard to the brownfield and what is the legal obligation? This is a question. I'd like to know what's the legal obligation to notice a fire on that site, that it's been mitigated, and what contaminants still remain, if any, at what concentrations. And also, because it kind of goes back also to transparency, and we've had this discussion many times about the testing, like the raw data compared to DTSC summarized data in their reports and how it differs, especially in particular with regard to our community. We found a lot of discrepancies, as well as when DTSC put forth the testing plan and created reporting limits for the testing, had generated reporting limits, but then when the final report came out, they varied exponentially. I mean, they were raised considerably. And so that is something that I would like to just bring to your attention to. We would like that transparency. And the other thing is, you mentioned orphan sites and limited funding and smaller portions. Those kinds of terms, I think, are what contributed to, like, I believe, a failure of investigating our site properly by certain individuals and within the department. And there are very good people that work within the department, but there are people that we unfortunately encountered that were not operating at a level to truly protect the public health and be considerate of human life in general. So,
what was the concern?
The orphan sites being when you're just discussing like the DTSC cleanup program and all of the various site cleanups that take place within the department, and then orphan sites not being listed here, but if they are real, I mean, they exist because of the fact that hazardous waste is not being tracked properly, as many of us in the room know that that's been an issue with the department, and actually on a federal level, because the manifests are not, they're incomplete, missing information, don't exist at all, they're illegible. There are many orphan sites that are being created because of that, and because there are polluters that are creating this problem. So that the language, just to hear the language, for me, that hits home, because that's the kind of, because my family was impacted and my neighbor people died on my cul-de-sac of 11 homes, 2 young moms in their 30s. And so we were all called, you're an orphan site, almost like, you know, you're an orphan, get out of here, we don't want to deal with you. And so, I mean, I think it's that it should be given equality within the agencies, sites as far as what you look to yourself as cleaning up. And so therefore, I mean, it just goes back to also that and transparency, that's the feedback that orphan sites need to be involved there. I mean,
Thank you. Can I, I'm going to suggest that we, actually want to add on?
Yeah, just want to add a little bit to that before we move forward. It kind of reflects back to the saying that's talking about the secure fund versus the voluntary cleanup. And then you have, for the voluntary cleanup, is something that the DTSC can say, well, this is something I don't have to confront this industry with.
Yeah.
Debbie Raphael was asked in 2014 what made her job difficult. She said, industry's pushback. And so she's not here. I mean, Debbie, Barbara's not here today to answer that question. But there was a meeting, you know, a Senate meeting. So that was a major concern of being able to do their job properly. So I don't think anything has changed. I think the industry's still pushing back. So when you talk about a voluntary cleanup and a forceful enforcement type of cleanup, there is a difference. And so now we're talking about an orphan cleanup. An orphan cleanup, there's no money. There's not an enforcement. There's not a voluntary cleanup where the business is saying, I'm going to clean this. This is something where they got to go get money from a different location in a fund that they have on site. And so in our situation, they said there's an orphan fund. But it took a lot just to get the department to admit that there was money in the orphan fund. So it's not just that there's money, there's getting, admitting to that there's money, and the department being willing to actually spend the money that is needed in that particular site to make sure that there's not a problem.
So I just want to point out something. That's sort of a term of art that we use, and we don't. I mean, the term orphan, really what that means is we haven't been able to identify a responsible party, someone who's liable that we can go and make them clean up the site. That's what we mean by orphan. And
is that illegal?
Oh no, the term orphan is not illegal term. I
use the word orphan because they don't want to use the word abandoned. Because every one of us knows what abandoned means. And if you want to cover up and use a nicer word, that's what I see.
Yeah,
and I don't want to hear it. If it's not a legitimate word, do not use orphan. Get out of our vocabulary, out of our discussion, and call it what the legal term is. It's abandoned. So if abandoned is the correct word, or you need to add another definition or expand the word of abandoned, I don't want the public needing to see orphan. It's abandoned. Okay.
This is really just feedback. I appreciate that.
We want that.
In the second meeting, one of the things we're going to be talking about a little bit is our site remediation account, which covers those types of.
That's why.
So I'm going to ask that we. So it's 12 o'clock, and we want to break for lunch at 12:30. So I'm going to ask that we try and capture what was just shared on the feedback to make sure we're characterizing it the way it's being shared, and then work through. There's actually, I think, some of the future slides people are going to have more questions. So I'd like to propose that we actually continue with this presentation and feedback and questions until 12:30, but then we break at 12:30 for lunch, and then I'm going to check in with the additional presenters with Jill and Jane if we pick back up after lunch with that portion. Would that be okay?
That's fine with me, but.
And I also just want to, let everyone know that we have a sizable chunk of time for community feedback, and I think the ideas that are being generated are wonderful. I'm actually very excited that the slides are able to generate this much, but I also want to reassure everyone that we do have a sizable chunk to really get into this problem identification, and problem solving type of discussion. So I'm hoping that we don't spend too much time on the slides and really do get to spend most of the afternoon with the conversation that I'm hearing already.
Okay, well, let's just park the fact that there's actually no orphan sites. That just means that DTSC was too unmotivated to go find an RP.
Actually, I would be able to if you want to just give a brief synopsis of kind of how an orphan site works, because we do work on quite a few of them.
I'm going to ask that might, maybe right after lunch.
It will be discussed during part 2, right? Discuss
But, you know, this is part of, I mean, you know, you can have it in these sections, but this is part of the dialogue. And for some people like me with short-term memory loss, I forget that something's brought up. So I think that we have a small enough group, knowledgeable, that I hear what you're saying, but I think we're good.
Yeah, if I can make a suggestion, just if we make notes on our slides, so then we have our conversation, so we can let them get through it. Sorry, Anna. So I mean, I wasn't gonna do that, and then I did. So.
Well, maybe we could.
That's your orphan, that's another orphan.
No, this is important to have. For Steve, given over what the orphans, what we were, why we're using that, or why that
Right,
term
I
is
can
used and
discuss
what
some
it
of the
is.
terms, right,
If we could do that, you know, right at the end. Some of it might be answered in the next slides, maybe not, but I'm going to ask you to have up there transparency around orphan sites, why orphan is used as a term, what it really means, transparency around raw data and legal obligations for real estate disclosure. And I think that was it from Zonia. Did that capture? And Floyd, those are the two.
Actually, I think transparency should be across for every site. I think that both with schools, related to schools, any facility that a sensitive receptor enters, a human being walks in the door of any building, anywhere, any structure, anything that DTSC has to do with, where there were toxic substances that existed, I believe transparency should be a mainstay of the agency's, you know, goals to achieve, to make sure that people are getting information, they're informed, they know what they're being exposed to, that, you know, what's happening at a site, that, where they will be spending their time, or, you know, living, working, whatever it is. Thank you.
Can I just do one more, just to do construction, to expand it to any kind of construction.
To expand the transparency around construction.
And because not just residential or
like Jordan down.
Yeah, just
okay, so not limited to residential areas, but any kind of thing that we're overseeing, commercial,
where there would be
school.
public impact.
So I turn it back over to the chief, and please continue to.
Amanda, can we move on? Okay, so now we're going to get into kind of switch gears and start talking more about the, you know, the issue of contaminated soil, what it means, and, you know, clearly, as from what we're hearing, the words matter, and when we hear one word, it means different things to different people. And so I'm going to try to define some commonly used terms, and keeping in mind, they're not like fixed definitions. And when I was trying to figure out how do we define contaminated soil, there isn't like one universal definition. But looking at kind of doing some of the research, what we came up with is there's the universe of contaminated soil state, where it's soil that contains chemical compounds that are potentially harmful to human health or the environment, and that it's also important to note that contamination comes from sources that are man-made, i.e. not naturally occurring. So that's the larger universe of contaminated soil that we talk about. Then there's this term called hazardous waste, and this actually is a legal term because there's legal definitions for hazardous waste, hazardous substances, and this is these are wastes that have certain properties that exceed regulatory standards and which is potentially dangerous and or harmful to human health and the environment. And this is a little bit more definable because there's ways that we can measure and put it into that regulatory bucket. And then there's what we call contaminated soil from site cleanups. And this is where sort of there's a little overlap here between hazardous waste and this universe of contaminated soil. Because when we talk about contaminated soil, there's all kinds of contaminated soil in the ground. If the ground is contaminated, that by itself does not mean it's a waste. The term waste comes about once, the moment you dig it out of the ground and it's contaminated, that becomes a waste. And once it's excavated, stored, and transported for disposal, then that contaminated soil may be regulated as a hazardous waste. It may also be treated as some other kind of waste, special waste or something else. But we at DTSC have a tracking system called the hazardous waste tracking system, and that we can measure the contaminated soil that's shipped off-site and tracked and manifested in accordance with applicable environmental regulations. And that is the measurable part of our contaminated soil universe that we're going to be talking about in the upcoming slides. So,
can I just add on a little bit more context? The reason for showing this slide, and I know we can hear discussion, questions are going to be generated. The reason we wanted to put the slide up, though, is to show that when we're sharing numbers, that we're sharing with you how the database works and how we track that. But, you know, a lot of this is around existing regulations, and I know that the words matter a lot. I just want to assure people that we put it up here just for background, so that when you see numbers, you don't think that we're trying to tell a different, or that you know what we're talking about with those numbers. And there are limitations to the databases that we have and how we track things and how we define things. But that was the purpose of providing just this is how the database that DTSC currently has works in tracking that information.
yeah, and I think it'll become a little bit clearer as we go to the next slide. But go ahead. Yeah, sure.
One, just under your universe contaminated soil, like where would mine tailings fit? Because it's somewhat,
Okay, so
it can be naturally occurring contamination.
Well, but mine tailings are a byproduct of mining operation, correct?
Even though it's not a man-made soil. I mean, so it's
Well,
included under this. Your definition.
But the tailings come from mining operations, correct? So then that is a man-made process.
Yeah. They've been processing. There is also something called the Dublin solution that's out there for certain processes, and depending on what sort of process something's been subject to as it's been extracted out of the ore or whatever, it can change it can exempt it from certain hazardous waste classifications. Doesn't mean that it doesn't have to still go to specific landfill, but it wouldn't technically get identified as a hazardous waste in some situations. So mining waste is a little bit unique. But, you know, in a mineralized zone, like where the miners were looking for a quartz vein and there was high arsenic in there, as long as it's not disturbed, it's considered actually occurring within the jurisdiction. We make recommendations for best management practices to avoid contact because of the health effects that can result from it that is within your jurisdiction.
Yeah.
I just have some like the zeolite or coal ash with that thing.
But anything that's naturally occurring that's in the ground that hasn't been disturbed and it's a natural formation like asbestos, until somebody goes in and decides they're going to carve into it, and then they've disturbed it, they've generated a release basically, and then it's subject to regulation.
Yeah, so because this is how DTSC defines or hazardous waste, one early concern of my organization and several others is the easiest way for California to reduce this reduction of hazardous waste is to not do cleanups. Because then suddenly you generate waste. You dramatically decrease the amount of hazardous waste in California. So when, for example, Kettleman City hazardous waste dump was expanded and there was an initiative to reduce hazardous waste by 50%, that is the concern because of this definition. Is again, the easiest way to meet Kettleman City, the initiative that came out of Kettleman City is to stop doing cleanups. And so that's why this definition is so problematic when you have another initiative to reduce hazardous waste. And so I know DTSC has made lots of promises that no, that's not what it means. That's not how we're actually going to meet our goal. Mm-hmm. But as you continue using this definition, we have to be very vigilant that our cleanups do not get less stringent, and that there's not an incentive to perhaps not do thorough investigations, not find new sites, and not do
that in place. So I would really want to add in there, and I appreciate you keep tracking that and keep saying it because it is the commitment and it is unequivocal that the department is not trying to reduce cleanups. It's not trying to reduce hazardous waste generation by reducing cleanups that protect human health and environment.
Right.
That is not the goal of the initiative from the beginning or this dialogue at all. We're just trying to share, we are trying to share as part of this what the current working definitions are and how things are tracked.
I would just say that perhaps we should think about changing that.
So if I could ask for that feedback, the definition of hazardous waste, implications for pushing or concern about it being met by reducing cleanups.
So then you're getting into, because really it's not hazardous waste until it's disposed of. Everything hinges on the term disposal.
It's not, we don't, the contaminated soil is not considered a waste until it's been excavated. Correct.
No, it has to be disposed of. The term disposal is critical, and this is a problem with the architecture. When you guys say we'll go change that definition is in riprap, and it flows into all of our hazardous waste laws, and it flows into Superfund. If I excavate lead-contaminated soil and I ship it to Mexico to be recycled, it's not waste. In fact, the department lost a case on that many years ago. So you have to dispose of it. It has to be headed to disposal to be considered a waste. You can dig up all the soil in the world if you want to, but if you're not disposing of it, it's still not considered a waste. And this is very confusing to the public. The other thing is that there's stuff that's dug up, and if it's below certain levels, it's not a hazardous waste. Okay? And that's like another, very complicated thing. Would you want it put in your front yard? No. But it's not a hazardous waste, so it's not headed into the manifesting program. And so there's just this fundamental disconnect, which allowed something like Wildemar to happen. And it allowed waste to go from Carson Gore to an Indian reservation when it shouldn't have. And so I don't think we want to get into all this here, but this is a very simplistic way of looking at stuff. And stuff is not RCRA waste, and it's not Superfund waste unless it's going to disposal. I can dig up really contaminated stuff, and I can take it someplace and say I'm recycling it, and it's completely outside the jurisdiction of the state because it's not being disposed of.
So I would say, can we get clarification as to what DTSC's definition versus what you see, Jane, in what you know to be the truth, and DTSC to know to be the truth, because right now we're seeing conflicting data, or hearing.
Well, the truth is in the law, and the law is not, you're not going to change this definition because it hinges on this whole concept of
hazardous waste is a legal definition. Okay?
Yes.
And I think what I'm hearing Jane say, and I think this is what we need to follow up on, is this idea of when is it disposal that triggers it being considered a waste? Now, in this case, I think she's right, because we track the volume of contaminated soil from site cleanup that's disposed off site, and that is what gets tracked in our hazardous waste tracking system. So, from that standpoint, I'm just trying to tell you, and this kind of ties into the next couple of slides, the reason we're setting it up this way is because we're trying to show you what is measurable, and what we measure is what goes into our hazardous waste tracking system. If soil is excavated and managed on site, for example, or treated, then it may not fall into this bucket. Okay, so I completely understand what you're saying, because these terms are confusing. They're even confusing to us. So we're not. Believe me, we're trying our best to try to explain it to you, but it's a challenge because it's hard for all of us to understand.
I still think that what you said applies. If they're removing it, then it's hazardous waste.
Well, why don't we move on to the next slide, because I think it might help explain what we're talking
removing
about.
it and disposing of it because we're not considering it something valuable to be used to be recycled from a contaminated site. There are too many constituents, say for instance, at Wildemar under the homes there, that as you all know, even just disposing into a landfill, there's certain cell areas that take this particular toxic substance, these toxic substances here, and these go here, and these go there, and
so can I ask for to look back around to Cynthia, and then it's 12:19, and we want to definitely eat at 12:30, but we'll pause wherever we're at. So Cynthia, and then back to you.
So here's a really good example of what you're saying on the community So there's another site in our community. It was there since the 40s, right next to a Superfund site, Farmer Brothers Coffee. Farmer Brothers Coffee decided to go to another state. Before we could even put our heads around that, the next thing you know, there's a facility going in. And so the way that they piecemealed out the development of that site, they basically said, no worries about anything here. We don't have to really know what's here because we're not taking it anywhere. It's staying on site. So they disturbed that soil, put it in the air, did whatever the hell they wanted to do with it, and we will never know. And we know what the next step is going to be as we start to investigate as well. There's concrete slab over it, so there's no exposure pathway, so you don't need to worry about it, which would have been the argument and was the argument when the Farmer Brothers facility was there and they wanted to put in a parking lot. They did the same thing. And so the problem is that you have times when a community has the ability to focus on something, then decades go by and the contamination has still been left there in place and the nightmare just keeps reoccurring. So I think that is the problem about saying if something is not leaving the facility, then it's not considered a hazardous waste. It's just contaminated soil. And so that's the feedback, because we hope at the end of these dialogues, there are going to come up with some themes of legislation and policies that do need to be changed. And I would think that would certainly, be something that you lead into that direction, because the way things get explained to community people, like with this, it's not waste until lifted off the ground, was something that was brought up to us on our Superfund side, and I couldn't really understand what in the heck they were talking about. But then later on, when they dug up the same waste in a different area, voila, the law must have dissolved because they could actually do something different, take it back to where it came from, to the polluter site. And so there's just too many of these little caveats that kind of go off on their own, and it's really hard for community activists and community members to follow the trail. There's like no certainty. One day it is contaminated soil, the next day it's hazardous waste, and it's back to contaminated soil. So we're asking for not just the transparency, but the clarification, and so that we can understand to see if there does need to be changes in policy.
Okay.
I'm just going to quickly mention two things. One of them is this site that Cynthia is talking about, Farmer Brothers site. We find out somewhere along the road, somebody decided it was a brownfield site. And that apparently opens doors that wouldn't have been open otherwise. And so now you could put an 11-acre building on top of that with 3 stories, so you can have 176 trucks coming in and out of that place. And I'm like, I don't think so. I don't see how any of that is something that falls into anybody's the way things ought to work scenario. And the other, and I'm thinking that it's possible that the US EPA has received direction from their upper management lately that that term brownfields can be generously interpreted so you can build stuff on top of contaminated properties. And I'm deeply troubled by that. The other monster that came on the scene several years ago, in my view, is something called a non-hazardous manifest. And so companies will use looks a lot like a regular hazardous waste manifest, but it's actually a non-hazardous manifest, which means the waste doesn't have to go to a permitted facility. And that was a really clever little tactic. The bevel exemption is another beautiful nightmare that I got involved with some years ago, and in the interest of lunch, I'm going to begin to talk about that.
Capturing concern around the definition of brownfields and
exactly
clarification around I'm going to have to put there a non-hazardous waste manifest.
And the fact that I thought brownfields were sites that were cleaned up the way they should be so they could be redeveloped for positive use. and not a property you can just, this thing with this site that's now the construction now at Farmer Brothers took a period of 3 or 4 months.
To the periphery of the county development. That site was considered a brownfield. I don't know how it could be considered a brownfield when it's an operating oil field. It hasn't even stopped, and they're going to continue pumping oil for 50 years after those homes are built. That's ridiculous.
Feedback. I don't know immediately more about that, but I'm going to ask that we keep it on there as definition of brownfields, especially if there's an operating unit or operating facility in an area, how that designation is brownfields occurs. I just don't know the answer to that. I'm happy to put that on the list.
Does the department have a brownfield definition, or is it all relying on EPA?
Well, it's a federal definition, you know, and it's typically an underutilized property that because of actual perceived contamination has not been put back into productive use. I mean, that in a nutshell is kind of a synopsis of the federal definition.
Well,
Actually, my wife, do you have a question? No? Okay.
so the brownfields, the federal brownfields law was created for liability relief for white hats. That's actually what a brownfields is. It has to do more with the liability provisions than it does like what kind of site it is. Any site can become a brownfield site. It's just that you have a white hat that wants to come in and get the liability relief provisions of the federal law or the state law, which is CLARA, right? So there's no difference between a brownfield site, a school site, a work for corrective action site, a Superfund site. They all can be just as contaminated. You can have any kinds of contaminants on them. If it's brownfields, it means somebody wants liability relief under those federal provisions. So that's the only difference. That's what I'm saying. You know, it's kind of like it's very weird for the public to have all these different things, and they're thinking, oh, maybe it's less contaminated. No, it can be just as contaminated.
Can I ask that you not go through every slide as originally intended, and just kind of walk through the highlights of what's left in the presentation? I think there's only a couple over the next 5 minutes so that people know what's in here. And then, or that's one option, that we just sort of have that information, and then after lunch we come back and have discussion with to include Jane and Jill's short presentations. Or if we just want to pause here and then pick up from where we left off after lunch, that's option number 2. Any feedback from folks in the room about whether you want to kind of quickly recap what's left?
I mean, what I could do is I could go through the remaining slides in like 5 minutes if we can just go through them, and then that might generate discussion later. But then I would just go through it without any pauses. Okay, then I can do that. So if we can go to the next slide. So what we were trying to set up was the fact that there's these definitions, which obviously can be confusing, but this big oval, we're calling the total universe of contaminated soil. And it's really not something we can quote unquote quantify because it's all over the place. There is that smaller oval, which we're calling contaminated soil from site cleanups, that's shipped off site. That's tracked through the manifests on our hazardous waste tracking system. That's what we can actually measure, and that's the reason why we're calling that out, is because that's what was used in this hazardous waste reduction initiatives to come up with our baseline. You have to come up with something you can measure in order to be able to track whether you're reducing it. But that's the challenge, because it's not by any means the only contaminated soil. It's by no means the only soil of concern, but it's the amount that we can track that's going off site, and the goal of the hazardous waste reduction initiative is to reduce that quantity over time. So the next slide, that's that yellow oval, the small one. That's what's tracked in this chart, and it's just from our hazardous waste tracking systems, how much contaminated soil is generated from site cleanups, and that's in California. So from 2000 to 2016, these are the annual figures, and you can see that you know, in 2000 it was a little bit over 600,000. In 2016, about the same almost, but there's been high variability. Some years it's gone up, other years it's gone down. You can see what's interesting to note, in 2008, you had a peak right there, and then after that, it went down significantly. So what we believe, the likely reason for that is that the amount of contaminated soil shipped off-site tracks very closely with the state of the economy, and specifically the amount of construction activity that is going on. There's a lot of contaminated soil that's generated and taken off-site when you have construction activities, you know, developments, that sort of thing. And so after 2008, the economic downturn, you see a big drop, and then until about 2013 when it started to pick up again. That sort of tracks with, you know, the state of the economy. And so the point from this is just to show there isn't a clear trend, but there is a lot of contaminated soil that's taken off site. It's highly variable, and it may be associated with the level of economic activity, really. So just something useful to know, and as that also, you know, sort of presents a challenge when we're talking about reducing the amount of hazardous waste, because if the economy starts doing really well, there's going to be a lot more, you know, soil that's going to have to be managed somehow, and so that's part of the challenge. If we go to the next slide, again, we're talking about that same metric that we measured, hazardous waste going off-site. We also looked at, well, where is the soil going? How much of it's going in state? How much of it's going out of state? And so what we found is, for the it's been roughly stable. Approximately, you know, roughly 60% of our waste tends to go in state, and the rest goes out of state. And there was, the exception was in 2013, the in-state percentage went down to under 40%, and we believe that, so there's about 2, maybe 3 facilities in the state of California that accept hazardous waste. You have the Kettleman Hills, you have Clean Harbors, Buttonwillow, and I think the Westmoreland one is not always accepting. So there's really 2 facilities that are clearly accepting. And in 2013, that was the year that Kettleman was not accepting hazardous waste. So that's probably why that percentage is low. So, but over time, there seems to be sort of a trend that it's roughly 60% of our waste is being taken in state, and the rest is going out of state. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to kind of give a very broad overview of some of the issues of soil cleanup, which is really meant to set the table for the discussions that are going to happen in the second and the third meetings. We're going to get into a lot more detail, but I just want to give a broad overview of some of the common types of soil contaminants that we see. And this is by no means exhaustive, but it's just to give you a flavor of what we're talking about when we look at soil contamination. And so, again, these are terms. Inorganics is one broad category, but when you think inorganics, you're thinking metals. Lead is one of your biggest ones. You have chromium, arsenic, mercury, and other metals. And, you know, some of the processes where this results from, you have some old smelting operations. You know, a lot of these are operations that aren't even existing today, but these are from legacy contamination from years past. For example, lead in gasoline. We don't have it anymore, but we had mobile emissions from lead in gasoline for many years, and that has resulted in soil contamination that's pretty widespread. Battery recycling, lead-based paint, another example. Plating shops and then other manufacturing processes have resulted in inorganic or metal contamination in these soils. Then we have this term we call semi-volatile organics, and this is kind of another broad category that includes polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs, dioxins and furans, and pesticides. So PCBs often come from capacitors and transformer usage. Manufactured gas plants were a source. Again, that's an old process from almost 100 years ago. But those created pH contamination in soils and sludges. Burn pits, I know Jane and I were talking about that earlier. Those can cause dioxins and furans contamination. And of course, agricultural processes, you all know, use pesticides heavily. So that can also be another source of soil contamination. Next slide, please. And then you have volatile organics compounds, which are primarily solvents, benzene, and other types of volatiles. Dry cleaning operations used chlorinated solvents, and that's ubiquitous. You see that all over the place in our soil and groundwater. Metal cleaning, degreasing operations, and then chemical and plastics manufacturing are also a big source of VOC or volatile contaminants. And then fuels, gasoline, diesel, jet fuels, waste oils. These you have underground storage tanks that house fuel. They're spread all over the place, and some of those were leaking, so those created contamination in the soil. Refineries, obviously, oil, water separators are sources of these types of contaminants. And again, this is not comprehensive. I didn't mention radiological waste is another category, and then munitions waste, which again, that was something that Jane was talking about earlier in the day. But we're just giving you sort of a broad overview of some of the types of contaminants that we're dealing with. Next slide, please. And this kind of touches on what we're going to be talking more about in probably the third meeting, is some of the technologies and options for soil cleanup. And you can look at these broadly in sort of three main groups. You have, how do you manage contaminated soil? You can either do immobilization, extraction, or destruction/alteration. And what we really mean by immobilization is taking the contaminants and making them either less mobile or create a situation where people cannot interact with them or be exposed to them. So, for example, solidification, stabilization, you add amendments to kind of like make them into a cement almost, and so that the contaminants can't move. The other more common type of immobilization is containment, where you can either take the soil and cap it and contain it so that people can't interface with it. And the most common is obviously what we've been talking about, which is landfilling. That's when you actually remove it out of the ground and then take it off-site into a containment facility where it's where it needs to be. If you're using that technology, the landfill has to be designed properly so that it does prevent exposure. So that's very key. Extraction is where you take the contaminant out of that soil media and either concentrate it or you remove it for further treatment or disposal. So you have soil vapor extraction, where you pull the volatile organics, for example, out of the soil, and you can either then treat it thermally or some other way. Thermal desorption, soil flushing and washing are technologies where you can use water to flush contaminants out of the soil matrix. And so the thing about extraction is it doesn't by itself treat the contaminants themselves. It's just sort of taking them out of the soil and putting them into another media where it needs further management. And so that's important to know. Either if you concentrate it, then you're creating a more concentrated waste that might actually have to go to another facility or needs to be treated in a different way. Then you have destruction or alteration, which you can be done either using thermal, biological, or chemical processes where, in this case, you're trying to take the contaminant and actually destroy it or convert it into a less harmful form. So thermal, you're thinking about incineration, where you're actually destroying the whole soil matrix. Contaminants get destroyed in that process. Biological treatment happens when you use microorganisms that naturally can then they actually feed on those contaminants, and they presumably will then create byproducts that are inert or less harmful. And then you have chemical processes where you can use, for example, in situ chemical oxidation to transform, for example, TCE into other, chemically transform it into other components which are less harmful. And that can, and all of these things, within these categories, you have treatment technologies that can be done in place, in the ground, in situ bioremediation, for example, where you inject bugs into the ground, for example, or ex situ, where you take it out of the ground and you treat it above ground. And so there's all kinds of ways you can, slice these cleanups, and we're going to talk more about them in much greater detail in the upcoming meetings. So this was just meant to sort of tease you all, I guess. And I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
Thank you
but
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajay, for the overview. I think I think it's very good that the slides generate all the discussion that has already been going on. I'd like to sort of suggestion of, if you've noted questions that you could go through on the slides, we'll talk about how to facilitate that after lunch. But thank you very much, Ajay and Steve, for putting that together.